Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Gervase Bushe as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our guest for today's episode. Dr. Gervase Bushe is a professor of leadership and organization development at the Beedie School of Business, Simon Fraser University, Canada, one of the world's top management research schools. Over 4 decades, he has helped organizations move from traditional hierarchies to more collaborative, agile systems, and new growing companies develop more structure without losing their flexibility and engagement. An award-winning author of over 100 papers and 3 influential books, including Clear Leadership, translated into 9 languages. Dr. Bush is widely known for advancing the appreciative inquiry approach and for co-editing the groundbreaking dialogic organization development. His most recent work, The Dynamics of Generative Change, explores how leaders can drive deep cultural transformation. A two-time Douglas McGregor Award winner and one of HR Magazine's top 10 influential HR thinkers, he continues to consult, teach, and clarify and certify leaders worldwide through the Bush Markside Institute for Dialogic Organization Development. In today's episode, Dr. Gervase Bushe discusses key ideas from his acclaimed book, The Dynamics of Generative Change. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gervase Bushe to the conversation. Professor Gervase, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, in the book, Consolidated Construction Materials Supply Transformed Without a Formal Vision or Detailed Change Plan, what convinced you that an emergent generative approach would better work than a classical plan change strategy in that context?
Well, so the case that I used to build the book around was in a large, old organization that provided services across a large geographic area and had a warehouse supply operation that had a centralized warehouse and then a lot of distributed uh, um, supply depots, you can call them. And when the general manager of supply chain asked me to help, his opening issue was, how do I create more collaboration amongst the 3 functional units in my operation? And like most organization development interventions, there's a presenting problem. And then as you get into the situation, you realize there's a lot more going on here. And what it really came down to was that they had an organization where the unionized employees really wanted to supply their internal customers. They wanted to be valued members of the team, so to speak. And in order to do that, though, they had to keep breaking the rules that they had set up. And every time they broke a rule, it created a different problem for them. And so they ended up having all these processes out of control. And they had tried numerous ways over the years to try to manage these problems by rules and and more formal processes. But and at one point I said to them, well, when you were the last time you were trying to create a set of rules and formal processes, did you have your internal customers be part of that conversation? And they said, oh yeah, we had the vice president of construction in here, and he agreed to all of them. And then a week later, he was yelling at some poor supply depot guy to just ship the stuff and break the rules, so it was pretty obvious to them, and the reason they called me, and it was pretty obvious to me that business as usual wasn't going to work. However, a more emergent dialogic approach was very out of their standard way of doing things. It's a very engineering-oriented company, and top down, decide on the right thing, try to drive it through the system. They had been through that many times before. So after a series of about 2 months I would meet with them about every 2 weeks and have a conversation about what's going on and why it's going on and all that, they decided to take a try and see how it would work.
Professor, you described starting with 200 poorly engaged employees spread across 3 fragmented units. What were
Mhm.
the specific early signals that told you this organization was actually ready for a different kind of conversation about change?
Well, the most important was the general manager was ready to do something different. And he's the person who contacted me. And he had heard me give a talk a few years previously. And he said, the stuff that you were talking about made a lot of sense to me, which maybe you can help us out. And I, as someone who works in the field of trying to change organizations, one of the things I learned over the years is you've got to have sponsorship. You've got to have somebody who has the authority and the resources to be able to actually come in and make the change happen. And if you don't have that, you're not going to be successful. So, unfortunately, as a university professor, I don't have to take on any projects. So I can, and I have, walked away from projects that they just don't have the sponsorship here. Often it's somebody that comes in from the middle, they got a lot of passion, they want to make something happen. And the first thing I'll do is say, they have a sponsor, and if they don't, then that's our first job is to try to go find one. And if the sponsorship isn't there, we're just going to end up. And early in my career, I had a number of these experiences of going in through the middle, working with the lower part of the organization. People get really excited. We're going to do something great, and then some senior person would come along and pull the rug out and create more despair. And it was worse than having done nothing. So that's the first and most important thing is do you have a real sponsor? I guess the second thing was that it had become clear to all of us that they were trapped in a series of polarities that we were able to name, right? And this is true of all organizations, right? The processes of organizing always require what appear to be opposite things, right? And some common ones were in this organization. Some of the uncommon ones was that uh, customers were the source of all pride, and customers were the source of all pain. And both those things going on. Another one was if you follow the rules, you get beat up, and if you don't follow the rules, you get beat up. Uh, so when you're caught in those sort of paradoxical issues, a more emergent dialogic adaptive approach seems to work a lot better. And so one of the ways to do that is to be able to name to create an image of an opportunity that brings those two things that seem to be opposite together. Something I call a generative image. And if you can find a good generative image to support an emergent change process, it almost always works. So I can say more about that if you'd like.
Professor, the first phase of the model is identify the adaptive challenge. In the consolidated case, how did you differentiate between technical problems and the deeper adaptive challenge that needed generative change rather than conventional fixes?
Well, you see, initially they defined it as a technical problem, and they had been defining it as a technical problem. And this is the thing that I find is, what we do in MBA schools is we train people to identify and solve technical problems. We give them formulas, right, to how to solve an issue. And the thing about an adaptive challenge is that there isn't a fix to it. There's not like any solution to that problem is going to create a new problem. This is one of my mantras is any solution to a problem of organizing will create a new problem eventually. Right? And because of the polarity nature of organizing, there's always this moving back and forth between, managing problems through people, managing people through technology, and so and then some people argue, like Ralph Stacey, that as soon as people are involved, you have an adaptive challenge, because human beings are not simple stimulus response mechanisms, right? We make sense of the world, and how one person will make sense of a situation is different from how someone else will. And then you have the narratives that exist in the organization, and every organization has a different set of narratives that people make sense out of what's going on. And so in order to create those sorts of changes, and then as we explored their issue, they wanted to keep defining it as a technical problem. But every time I pushed up against, well, how's that work for you in the past? They'd say, well, it hasn't. Right. So it became clear over time that the normal way of doing things wasn't going to work. Now, in this case, it wasn't necessary to define the adaptive challenge. And to give words to it. It was just a sense of there's this big problem. And really the way the general manager defined it is it's become a good day is not getting yelled at. And that is destroying morale throughout the organization. And we got to stop that. Okay. You could say that that was the adaptive challenge. How do we create a form of organizing here where people aren't getting yelled at every day, right? They're serving their customers externally, and they're managing their processes internally so that they're working together and they're not constantly bumping up against broken processes. Now they had a bunch of other limitations. The biggest one was that a big SAP implementation was coming down. So they weren't allowed to touch their IT system, but their IT system was broken and out of date. So that was creating real problems for them as well. And they couldn't manage a technical fix for it. So we all agreed that, and without having to, define the adaptive challenge. Now, in some organizations, you get leadership where that's really important to them. They want to kind of nuance it and get all that. These people were much more sort of boots on the ground. Let's get some action. Let's do something kind of folks. So they were willing to try something.
Professor, a pivotal step in the book is reframing the situation into a possibility-focused purpose statement. Can you
Yeah,
walk us through the generative image that emerged yet consolidated and how that shifted the energy in the system?
right. So there's a movement afoot right now, and you see it in academia, of a recognition that there's a big difference between vision and purpose. Now, people use different words for this, but so much of the focus in organizational change and leadership has been the need for a vision. And a vision is a picture of an end state. It's a goal. And we'll know, and in a good vision, is when we'll know when we've accomplished it. It's a place to get to. And the problem with visions, well, there's two problems. One is no one knows if it's a good vision until years later, and lots of visions turn out to be not very good, and particularly in complex environments, which more and more organizations are facing. The research is coming out is pretty clear that um, most companies that succeed in complexity do not have a big vision that they are putting a big bet behind, but rather they're doing something different, which is they're trying out a lot of things and learning as they go. As somebody recently said to me, that's how entrepreneurs operate. You try out a bunch of stuff and you learn as you go, and you build up from there. And this generative change process is essentially the same. You try out a lot of different things and you learn as you go. Now, but in order to engage a large group of people in a more emergent process, you need either common identity or common purpose, right? So what we're doing here is we're operating at the level of the social construction of reality, right? Social reality is being constructed all the time as people interact. But for the most part, when different people come from different parts of an organization and interact, they interact more like a federation, right? Each one has their own area of interest. People come there representing a larger group behind them. If they're a manager or something, they're supposed to, promote a set of interests, an agenda, gain resources. And when you have that going on, where you don't have a common purpose, then what will emerge is some socially constructed reality that's a balance of these different forces and powers and all that, and it doesn't cohere. You can't use that for a generative change process. So what happens in most cases where these things are successful is you have a common purpose. And what a purpose is what we're trying to do every day. So it's not a vision like we're going to well, no one will get there. But what we're trying to do every day and taking steps toward it, recognizing that whatever we can do today to do that, we might not have been able to do yesterday, and we might not be able to do tomorrow. And maybe what we can do tomorrow will be different from what we can do today. But here's what we can do today. So let's move and let's build the adaptive capacity of the organization as we're doing that, right? So that we become a flywheel of innovation and learning as we keep moving toward our purpose. So, right. So what's different about generativity as a focus from diagnostic organization development or change management, right, is that those forms of change are based on problem solving. What problem solving does is it tries to fix today by analyzing what went wrong in the past and how we're going to make that better so that we can do something better today. What generativity does is it focuses on the future and says, what do we want more of? And how do we get more of that, right? As a way to improve what we're doing today and be better today. So they both have the same intent, but they come at it from two different ways. And what we've learned, and I think that the data in here is very strong, is that when you use a problem-solving approach, like for example, I did this one study where we looked at using a problem-solving approach versus a more generative approach in an organization in Chicago. We invited people in to help. So the problem-solving groups would come together and they would work on the problem, and then afterwards everyone would leave. And we did things where we asked them to describe their mental maps before and after. And after the problem solving event, their mental maps were more deficient, more impoverished, and smaller. Then we used a more generative approach where we asked them more to focus on the future. And after the actual event, people would stick around, have coffee, be in conversation, and their mental maps got much richer and larger. Right? So so this is what kind of thing that has really, powered mine and other people's interests in a more generative approach, which is a possibility focused future and inviting people into conversations about how do we get that, right? And if it's around something people care about, then you've got that common purpose. So what will emerge from that will be in service to the whole. You can, if people come together to work on something that they all care about, they'll come up with stuff. They'll get it done because they care about it. Right? So that's what that means. And we see that happen naturally all the time, right? Emergence is nature's way of changing. And when some crisis strikes, right, amongst a group of people who identify with each other, who feel a sense of common identity, the common purpose emerges as they manage it, right, without needing hierarchical control structures. In fact, it seems like hierarchical control structures get in the way of the normal, and so what we see, one of the things we see happening in business now is that organization design is moving towards more self-organizing processes in those sorts of industries that need a lot of innovation and a lot of change and a lot of continuous improvement for those very same reasons. Control structures seem to get in the way of that natural flow. Now, that'll create a new problem. you know, and and any organization that's going to be able to survive long term is going to have to keep innovating its very way of organizing, because we become, too loose, and then we become too tight, and then we become too loose, and then we become, so yeah. But a generative change strategy, anyway, is premised on a future focused purpose statement. And then if you can find a generative image for that, well, then the thing runs itself.
Professor, engage stakeholders in generative conversations sounds elegant, but on the ground, it can be messy. What did those conversations actually look and feel like in warehouse and distribution staff in a low-tech traditional environment?
Yeah, well, so if you invite people into a conversation, so first of all, I think for generative conversations to be effective, it needs to be voluntary. This is a lot of different people say this for different reasons, but you want to have as much difference as possible. You want it to be voluntary. The more concern people have, the more it feels like it's urgent, the better, you know. And what brings people into that conversation is the purpose statement. Now, in this case, what had happened was we came up with this generative image, stress-free customer service, right? And it took the two parts. Like there's this getting yelled at every day, but I'm getting yelled at because I want to either serve my customers, or I'm getting yelled at because I'm breaking the rules. It's causing me stress. And one of the attributes of a great generative image is, first of all, nobody knows what it is. In this organization, what is stress-free customer service like? Two, it's attractive. Yeah, it sounds good. I'd like that. I don't know how to accomplish it. Number three, it opens up a field of conversation that had never existed before. Because if they got together to talk about it, they'd be talking about the problem, who's to blame, who should be looking after it, what can we do? We can't do anything. Oh, despair, you know. But here we open up a field of possibility for different conversations to take place. Now, I have some ground rules for what needs to happen for a good generative conversation to take place. So first of all, are people coming with a common purpose? Secondly, so do we know why we're here? Third, do we have the relevant knowledge to understand the situation, right? And if those things aren't in place, then you need to put those in place before we come together. Then what we need to do is to create conversations with people where people can discover who in the room has similar interests and agendas and ideas so they can find each other, and then create opportunities for them to find each other and for them to come up with new ideas they want to act on. And the purpose at the end of that is to launch as many of those as possible. So typically we would go into a generative conversation, we'd have some guide rides. So in the case of the first one that happened at Consolidated Construction, we invite people to come to a meeting where we're going to talk about how to create stress-free customer service. And the general manager said, and this was the first time that unionized employees had been invited into any kind of conversation with management. And so what he said is, the first 3 people from this group, the first 4 people from that group, that they'll put up their hand, I'll pay for you to come. Well, your housing and all that, we're all going to meet in the central area on a 1-day thing. And so about 70 people showed up, which surprised the managers to begin with. Okay. And then what we did was we had the 3 different groups, the internal functions, each would go off into their own space and put together a presentation to the rest of the organization around here's what causes us stress in trying to please our customers. So they come and make those presentations and open it up to question and answer and all that. And part of what started to happen there was people got to test some of their narratives that turned out to be false. Because of course, people make up stories about the other group, and this is why things don't work. And it's all, and once you start digging into those stories, you always find out that no, there's something much more reasonable going on. Right. And then after they got to hear each other's stuff, they went back into their groups, and then they came back and did another presentation on here's what we think we could do to reduce stress for you, and here's what we think you could do to reduce stress for us. So they got to hear that from each of the 3 groups. And then the groups went back together and decided who's going to go meet with the other group. So now we created 3 new groups of interdepartmental groups to come together to talk about what can we do? What can we do start tomorrow that would help us increase stress-free customer service? And out of that came 12 pilot projects. So we called them pilot projects. So in a generative change conversation, what you want to do is launch as many of these as possible within some guardrails. And these are guardrails for can't increase headcount, can't mess with the IT system, can't create more stress for somebody else. There was like half a dozen of them, right? But anything that'll meet those guardrails, we'll accept, we'll support. So that to me is like what I'm designing when I'm designing a generative change event is like we want to have what we don't want, and what often happens when people who use these kind of techniques is at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of proposals that are then given to management, right? And then management walks away and decides what it's going to implement or not implement. And we're back to the typical change management problem. But in a generative change, what we want to do is want to launch as many of these and then learn as we go. So what's critical is to have put in place already a mechanism for monitoring what happens afterwards. And that takes management attention and senior leadership attention, which is different from what typically happens in a change management scenario. Typically in a change management scenario, all the leadership time is spent at the front end designing the vision, and then it's handed off and they go do other stuff. And I think the research shows that most of the failure of change management is because of that. Because leadership stops paying attention, hands it off. Now the middles are in charge of implementation, and that doesn't work. So in this case, you don't need a lot of leadership front end because it's not up to them to design a vision or anything else. where their real effort is at the back end. Once these pilot projects have been launched, they need to pay attention to what's going on, what's working, what's not working, what are the barriers people are running into, can we remove them? Is this project worth supporting long-term or not? What are we learning from it? The learning is critical. How do we pass that learning around? So, uh, and that's what they did in this case.
Professor, you emphasize self-initiated probes rather than top-down initiatives. Could you share one or two probes that from the case that seemed small at first but turned out to be catalytic for engagement or digitization?
Well, one of them I talk in the book is one of the people realized two of the groups got together and they started to, we have this catalog that we order supplies from, and there's a standard package. So if we order, a box of nails, we expect 100 nails. So we order 100 nails. But it turns out over time, the vendors are changing the standard package. So now there's really 120 nails in a box, but we order 100 nails because that's what's in the catalog. So some guy has to go in the central warehouse, take 20 nails out of a box, stick them somewhere, it, and so they decided to look into this. They discovered almost half of their catalog was out of date. Um, and this was causing all sorts of, so it was a real simple fix, and a lot of times when you start doing this sort of thing at the beginning, a lot of the frontline stuff is simple and it's simple fixes and it just reduces like problems. My experience is that lasts for about 18 months. And then the sort of the frontline stuff, they're tapped out. And then most of the important innovations are going to come from the middle. But anyway, in this case, that went on. One of the things that came out was that one of the biggest reasons for stress and problems for the supply groups outside was that they didn't know if they were getting their last order before they had to make their next order for a number of reasons that couldn't be fixed easily. And so they kept gaming the system because I may have ordered so many bolts my last one. I don't know if they're going to show up. So what came out of that first generative event was a couple of different ways of approaching this problem, which all came down to, in a sense, can we speed up the delivery process or can we solve that? And the managers realized that this wasn't something that a small group could fix. This was a larger problem. And so they decided we're going to run another generative change event to look at this specific problem, what we can do about it. And that turned out to be a 2-day thing. And what came out of that was the warehouse employees agreeing that the best way to create stress-free customer service was to reduce turnaround time on orders that came from the field from 3 days to 1 day. Now, they did it. They did it in 6 weeks. And, at first the managers were arguing amongst themselves, is this a real thing? And anybody who's been in the change business knows if you had run that like a standard thing where, okay, here's a bunch of proposals, let's give it to the management to do something with, 6 weeks later, they'd still be talking about it. But by saying, okay, go do it, just go do it, you know what to do, go do it. Within 6 weeks, they'd gone from 3 days to 1 day turnaround time. So that in itself was pretty amazing. But one of the things that happened during that particular event was one of the managers who had been tasked with preparing for this SAP implementation noticed this small group in receiving, three young guys who had an interest in technology. And their proposal was at that time, when something came into receiving, somebody would write down on a piece of paper what had come in, put it on a clerk's desk. Those would pile up until somebody entered it into their database. They said, why don't we put a laptop on a cart, move it over to receiving, and we'll just, enter it as it comes in. Well, that seemed like a good idea. So this guy, and this is the whole idea behind generative change. Pay attention to what's going on, notice what the opportunity is, build on it, right? So he approached them and said, hey, what do you think about this? And he showed them these tablets that he had gotten from construction that were able to interface with their database system. Try using this, instead of a laptop. And they did, and they liked it, but they found it kind of bulky. So then he introduced them to barcoding because these machines could read barcodes. So all of a sudden now they were barcoding stuff and using this, and they loved it. They thought this was great, but these were bulky. And so then he introduced them to little scanners you can put on your belt. Well, within a couple of weeks, everybody in receiving one of their scanners. And anyway, long story short, from this small beginning, just by building on it and building on it and building on it and integrating more and more people into it, within 18 months, they'd gone from essentially a paper and pencil operation to a fully digital one with the whole warehouse barcoded using scanners with the supply depots out in the field using iPhones to, read the barcodes to make their it just everything. And they totally got to a place where they were experiencing stress-free customer service, right? Without a plan, without a budget. At one point, and part of what goes on in any sort of major change process is the importance of your senior managers managing the politics. And in this organization, they had tried a digitization effort a couple of years previously that had flamed out and had gotten a bad name. And so they couldn't call it that. I forget what the phrase they came up with. It's in the book. Is point of use. That's what they call it. Point of use. And so at one point, they trotted out some of the shop floor employees. They had a big 300-person senior management event, and the senior manager got them on the agenda. And they came out and did a 15-minute presentation on point of use. And the senior manager who had been managing this whole change, the internal organizational effectiveness person, looked at him and said, like, what are you doing? Where are your Gantt charts? Where's your standard change management practice here? And he went, look, it's just me. I don't have, okay. They were kind of aghast, but anyway, right. So not only a complete transformation in about 18 months in the whole structure and technology in this place, but a complete transformation in its culture, right? Where you had a sort of cynical, recalcitrant, unionized employee base. Now, assuming that they had every right to be involved in decisions, upgrading, changes. If there was a meeting to make a decision about stuff, there'd be a few of them involved. They were autonomously making changes in how things were warehoused to help move stuff faster, right? And all around sharing a common purpose, which was stress-free customer service.
Professor, one striking line in the description is that this change happened without resistance. When you look back, was resistance truly absent, or did the generative process surface and transform resistance in a ways that look very different from typical change projects?
Yeah. The only resistance that I became aware of was one middle manager who had a little fiefdom, was responsible for one area of their geographic area, who thought this whole sort of opening up to the employees was not a great idea. He eventually came around, but it was also he was getting close to retirement, so he retired out. Now his resistance didn't amount to much because all of this was there was nothing he could do to stop it, and the stuff was working. So and my career started back in the early 80s with quality of life work at General Motors, where there was an attempt to engage hourly employees in problem solving, that sort of thing. And there was a layer of resistance amongst middle managers, typically who felt like they were being disempowered, right? And my doctoral dissertation was a study of that, and what I found was that they didn't have any power to start with. that was the problem, was that they felt disempowered to begin with, and now they see these people they're supposed to be managing being empowered, and they're not getting empowered. And what we saw was in those facilities, that began with empowering the middles before empowering the bottoms, the whole thing just expanded like crazy. and had a tremendously positive impact. So, um, so in that kind of engagement effort with the middles, it's important that they understand and they see how this is going to empower them. So, for example, the manager of the central warehouse, after that second engagement event, just went bananas. Like he just was wandering around going, this is the way to manage. Like he didn't experience that as a loss of power. He experienced that as, in fact, now he can get stuff done that he could never get done before. So it depends. That's where the resistance is more likely to lie. Now, as well, you have to look up and go, like, is this going to create problems further up? And so when I was initially scoping sponsorship, one of my initial questions was, is the manager of supply chain, does he have enough authority to be able to do this, or does he need to have his boss engaged? And it turned out, no, he didn't. His boss was a pretty hands-off guy, and as long as they were making construction happy, he didn't have to worry about it. And there wasn't enough interdependencies externally for that to be a problem. Later on, one of the middles there who got really excited about all this wanted to create another engagement event. We ended up calling it crew shops. They came up with this name for a crew shop, which was a fun name. He wanted to have a crew shop with this other part of the organization that was causing problems for them. And I said, yeah, that's great, but we got to make sure we got sponsorship over there. And so we engaged the senior manager to talk to the senior manager over there about what this might be. And it turned out that other manager was not going to support this kind of way of doing things. So much to this manager was sure that this was the solution. We're going to have a cruise shop with this other group. We're going to solve all these problems. I'm like, you don't have sponsorship. So forget it. It's not going to work. Yeah.
Professor, the book is written to help both novice and experienced dialogic OD consultants. What do you want most senior leaders who may never call themselves OD practitioners to take away from this case about their role in generative change?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a kind of leadership that's needed now in times of turbulence and uncertainty. I call it generative leadership. And it's different from the kind of leadership that most, books talk about, this sort of visionary, the kind of John Cotter, drive it down through the system kind of thing. And so instead of the captain on the ship saying, I know the way, follow me, and instead they say, I don't know the way, but I know what the issue is, and I invite you to be engaged in, helping us all figure this out. And when you look at most successful cultural transformations, that's what you find. They start with a leader who, I don't know how we're going to get there, and I don't know exactly where there is, right? But I know, so one of the most interesting to me transformations has been DBS Bank. That went from, in Singapore, they went from the very bottom of the league tables to the top. Initially their customer service ratings were abysmal. Now they're considered the best. And do you know what their generative image was that they used to power their change? Joyful banking. How do we make banking joyful? Now, again, so a leader, it's that stuff that goes, I don't know what joyful banking is, but I think that's what we need, right? And we'll go into the branches, we bring in customers, suppliers, how can we make banking more joyful and engage those people in coming up with ideas for that and then saying, yeah, great, go do it. Don't wait for us, don't wait for a plan, don't wait for a committee, and if you need some money, because that's the other thing. If you're going to launch a generative change event, you want to be able to offer resources. So you need to already have some of that put aside. So when people need a few bucks and they need a meeting room or something like that, they know how to access it. Joyful banking, I love that one. But there are many different examples of that. So I've forgotten your question now.
Professor, I understand that you have been editing and publishing a series of books authored by consultants experienced in generative change. These works explore various aspects of the generative change approach in greater detail. Could you share more about them?
Thanks. Yeah, so Bob Marshak and I created this Bush Institute, because we were getting a lot of requests. Well, where do I learn more about this? And we didn't know where to send them. So, and one of the things we decided to do is to launch a series of books kind of based on the Addison Wesley series in OD that had been formative in the 70s. And so we've got 10 books now, and they're only 100 pages each, and they're all focused on a specific theory of practice, and they're written by someone who's a very successful change practitioner. Um, and they cover a variety of different aspects. So there's my book on Dynamics of Generative Change, which is the whole model. There's another book by Tova Averbuch on how do you enter in contract when you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. Really great book. There's another book by Sarah Lewis that looks at the initial sets of activities in developing internal understanding and excitement about adopting a generative approach. There's a book on how do you so one of the shifts that's happened in the dialogic OD world is we've moved away from facilitating toward hosting. And so it's a book on hosting. What does it mean to host, and how do you do that effectively? And so when I was starting out in the field, I learned to be a facilitator. And as a facilitator, what I would do is I would stand in the front of a group at a flip chart, and I would attempt to have good conversations. Good. I knew, how do we solve problems together? How do we make decisions? What are the rules for doing that well? Manage a group through that, and at the end of which, after a day, we'd have walls filled with paper, now they're Google Docs. Same thing, right? With apparently a lot of decisions made and agreements made, and then people would go back to work and then nothing would happen. And I thought I must be a terrible consultant. And then I realized what was going on was people would say one thing in the room, and then they would go out in the hall and talk about what they really think. And I started to call out the organization's inner dialogue. It's like, we have our own little inner dialogue, and then we have what comes out of our mouths. And if those things don't match, it doesn't matter what gets said in the room, right? And part of the problem was that as a facilitator, I was kind of deciding this is what they need to do next. This is where they need to go. This is the conversation they need to have. And so when they were talking, they weren't talking to each other. They were talking to me, right? And I'm writing things on a flip chart or doing whatever I'm doing there. Well, we need a vision now, so let's work on that. And now in the dialogic OD world, we don't do that anymore. I feel like when I'm working with a group, if they're talking to me, they need to be talking to each other. And what we do when we host is we create a space in which certain conversations are more likely to happen than others. And because they're engaged in the conversation, they take much more responsibility for what comes out of it than when you have someone facilitating that, and they kind of give responsibility over to the facilitator. And so typically, in a large group event, you've got 80 people. How are you going to facilitate that? You need small groups operating. And if you want to have one facilitator per group, it's quite expensive anyway to begin with. But we learned it doesn't work well. But again, you got to have people who are voluntarily there because they care about the issue, they want to do something about it. Then you don't need to facilitate it. But you do need to create spaces where certain conversations are more likely to happen than others. Generally, it's by the questions you ask, right? How you position that. And there are a lot of different methodologies out there for doing that. I've started about 5-6 years ago just tracking a bibliography of, now I have over 60. Anyone can download from the Bush Institute website of stuff that's been written about. There's also a bunch out there, like certain consultants don't write about their stuff because it's part of their proprietary IP, right? So anyway, so hosting, I think, as an image of what we do as consultants, as opposed to facilitating, is a really different and important shift that comes out in the books that we publish. And we're finding ways to, but from an academic point of view, what I'm really excited about is that there's more and more research now being generated. Like dialogic or OD has become a generative image of its own. And there's a a study that came out a couple of years ago in Jobs that looked at 79 different examples of organizational change and the mindset that the leader was using. And what they found was that more than half of those cases, the leader was operating from a more traditional diagnostic mindset. And that only 30% of the change events were considered successful, which is a pretty consistent number. But when leaders were operating from a dialogic mindset, 90% of the cases were successful. But what they found was that in most cases, leaders went back and forth between diagnostic and dialogic. And 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 to me, that makes total sense. Like I think that this integration of and so super important. Yeah, have to emphasize over and over again is that dialogic OD is not a method. It's a way of thinking about change and leadership. And the generative change strategy is just one strategy. There are other strategies for change that are used in dialogic OD, right? But there are all these different methods. And these methods can be used from a diagnostic mindset or a dialogic mindset, but it's not an either or. And that in most cases, successful practitioners, successful leaders of change are blending them. So sometimes what they want to know is what's real. Let's get the data. We need the data, get the data out. Sometimes what they want to know is what do people think is possible? What do they care about? And what are the new ideas they're willing to act on? Right? That are coming from them. And it's a blend of those two things. Like when do we do this and when do we do that over a period of time that is visible in most cases of successful transformational change.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, where do you see the generative change model adding the most value? In digital transformation, cultural change, post-merger integration, or somewhere else entirely? And what kind of adaptive challenges are the best fit for this approach?
Okay. Well, so first of all, I would say that the generative change approach has been around for decades. It just hasn't been named, right? So this has been going on for a long time, but it hasn't been named. It isn't that visible. It's got some of the emergent change is probably a more recognized term. Adaptive change, adaptive leadership is a more recognized term. But what I hope I've done with this generative change model is identify the critical components that make it successful. Right? Because when a lot of times, like one of the things I found when I started studying these different, what I've come to call dialogic change, they're methods that you can use dialogically, but you can also use them diagnostically, right? And so people would use these methods, and sometimes they'd work, and sometimes they wouldn't, and people didn't understand why. And so what we've tried to do with dialogic OD is identify what's going on under the hood when they're successful. And with the generative change model, I've tried to identify what's under the hood when generative change approach, regardless of what you call it. And the fundamental thing that makes it a generative change approach is that you are inviting the people who are going to have to change in identifying the changes they want to make and inviting them to just go do it. And we're going to learn as we go. That's what makes it a generative change approach. So what are the things that need to be in place for that to be successful? That's what the model is about. And it's been used in all sorts of situations. Both, I've just published a case on a team, inter-team development thing, where again, it was successful. Organizationally, inside organizations, even opportunities to use it as sort of a more social, global kind of managing some global problems, that sort of stuff, or some social problems. And again, when elements of it are missing, that's when you see it not work. Maybe there wasn't a clear future focused purpose. Maybe there wasn't clear sponsorship. Maybe there wasn't put in place the kind of things that would be needed to monitor what's happening afterwards and support them. But so what I've tried to do with the generative change strategy is describe what are the key elements that need to be in place for whatever actual method you use to be successful. And all those things you mentioned are opportunities. for using the generative change strategy. Where it can't be used, there's a couple places you can't use it. Number one, if the change is going to require large capital investments, just saying, decide what you want to go do it. It's not going to work. Or where the changes you're talking about have a lot of interdependencies. Some people can't just go off and do something. It's not going to work. So it has to be in situations where people can, without a lot of extra resources, can act on their own volition, and they don't need to manage a lot of complex interdependencies.
Thank you, Dr. Bush, for sharing such insightful perspectives on generative change and transformational leadership. Your experiences have given us a powerful practical picture of how organizations can evolve in more human, collaborative ways. To our listeners, we hope this conversation inspires you to rethink how change happens in your own teams and workplaces. Thank you once again, Professor Bush, for joining us on Business Talk, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you once again.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.